So, and I'm going to now, we'll start our my presentation will be for about 35 to 45 minutes, and we can get started. Now, let me see. Let's see. Can people see this PowerPoint?
Yes, I can see it very well. And if you hit present at the top, it'll take up the full screen on the top right.
On the Zoom.
On the right-hand corner, next to the orange share button, it says present.
Everybody should go on mute, please. Let me see. I'm not doing too well with this.
It's right. So there's an orange B in a circle.
Yeah.
And then to the left, 2 buttons of that. It says present. Yeah, there you go. Now to the left, 2 times to the left. 1 and then 1 more. There you go. And then you can use arrow keys to select to go to the right.
Okay, so does everyone see that? Yes, okay. Well, I'm going to begin right now. And this is I'm starting with a picture of, it was a painting by an Arabic artist who did this a long time, many years ago, in terms of a depiction of Maimonides. Now, the next picture that I have here is actually a portrait of Maimonides that's in the gallery of the US House of Representatives in terms of the actual House floor. There's about 23 marble relief portraits over the gallery doors in the House chamber. And they depict many leaders of influence over in world history that were lawgivers. And they've chosen in addition to Maimonides that was chosen, some of the other historical figures that were chosen was Moses is portrayed, Hammurabi, the Roman Empire, Justinian I, Napoleon, and we can't leave out Thomas Jefferson. And in terms of, so learning in Islamic cultures, I think is something where I'd like to start with. So how is it that Maimonides became a leading intellectual in world history? He was widely respected by Jews and Muslims. He was an important philosopher and an extensive author on Jewish law. In terms of learning for a famous Jewish intellectual in the time of Islam, Jewish fathers would almost begin instruction for sons in Torah as soon as they started to learn to speak. At age 5 to 7, a child was brought to an elementary school teacher. Children sat in class whole day and part of the night. I think children were discouraged from normal childhood play. Actually, you could probably think that, I think normal childhood play is probably an invention of the last maybe couple of centuries. Boys studied the entire Tanakh, Torah, prophets, and writings. This was a period when books were scarce, and so instruction was done mainly by dictation and memorization. Spanish schools of higher learning abandoned the curriculum of the traditional Babylonian academy, which is really the yeshiva. So in Islam, under Islam, in many of the Jewish intellectuals, the instructors would encourage secular learning at this time, and the student would acquire expertise in Hebrew, poetry, and Arabic to enhance the professional options. Now this is, you might think that this is, and we'll discuss it a little bit later, but this is maybe different than many of the other yeshivas that would be in other areas of the world outside of Muslim areas. Again, for Maimonides, there were actually 2 men that had the greatest influence on Maimonides in terms of his learning. Isaac Al-Fasi, Joseph Ibn Miknash, they were both masters at the Lucena Academy, which was a yeshiva in Spain, in Muslim Spain. Al-Fasi wrote a book called A Book of Precepts. It was basically took dispersed topics and disjointed commentary that, in the Talmud, there's, you could see that it's many times somebody reading the Talmud will see that the text could be considered seemed disjointed. So what Al-Fasi did was he drafted a compendium of law, which was really bedrock law. And he wrote this in a sense that was followed the orders of the Talmud, but he left all the explanations which would explain his bedrock law, and he left this to the end of his treatise, and it would be placed in Arabic supplements. Maimonides wrote it in a similar code, the Mishne Torah, and he wrote it very much similarly to Isaac Al-Fasi. The Mishne Torah provided basis for legal rulings and case decisions, but did not cite the Talmudic sources. And Maimonides' goal was to liberate the student from a traditional method of Talmudic study, enabling them to follow an education program combining Torah with science and philosophy. And this was seen as a way to afford a intellectual the ability to engage in secular studies without being engaged in protracted Talmudic study. At the age of 18, students were ready to study mathematics, astronomy, logic, and physics. Maimonides, actually, in addition to being this tremendous lawgiver, people may know that he was also a medical doctor. He arrived in Fez, Morocco, at the age of 25, and at that time he began a study of medicine and did clinical training in Fez. He got his training through private tutoring and supervision, and that accounted for most of his medical education. Some teaching was done took place in hospitals and madrasas. Maimonides' family actually ended up becoming a medical dynasty, with one generation teaching the next generation. Some historians suggest that Maimonides was actually a court physician to Saladin, and later his son, Al-Affadel, beginning in about 1180 and after. I have a note that says you have logged into another device. Your polling session is inactive. Can people see me and continue to see the presentation?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to now go to start with really go over like a history of Maimonides' life. Now, this here, let's see. Excuse me. Okay. I'm bringing up same as we're going to start a discussion about Maimonides' life. I also bringing up Rashi, and the reason for that is that Rashi was born in 1040 and died in 1105. But many of the same circumstances that happened or occurrences that happened during Rashi's life also happened during the life of Rambam's father and Rambam himself. Rashi, during his later life, the first Crusades took place. Which started in 1096. The Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099. Similarly, Maimonides' father was born in 1110, which was about 5 years after the death of Rashi, and the father lived until 1170. Maimonides was born in 1135 and died in 1204, which is about 100 years after Rashi's passing away. Rambam was born in Cordoba, which was a Spain city of about 250,000 to 300,000 people. During the Rambam's life, the Second Crusade took place, which was 1147 to 1150. And also, during the Rambam's life, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem in 1186. So, but what you really have to focus on is that in in Eretz Israel, or the Holy Land, there was this back and forth between Muslim and Christian armies, both in the Eretz Israel, but also it was also going on in Spain as well. People don't realize that, but there was, in a sense, there was a crusade going on in Spain, and because what you have is a conquering Islam army that's coming in a 7-11. The reason why I brought up Rashi was that I'm going to close with some discussion about the Rambam's reaction to the issue of martyrdom and what should be done in the case of your forced conversion. And I'm bringing up that because I'm going to make some comparisons between what was said in the Talmud with what Rambam has written. Particularly, I bring up, and why I brought up Rashi was because Rashi's son-in-laws were actually the persons who wrote down the additional commentary that's included in the Talmud, and it's called Tosafot. And so it's Rashi's son-in-laws and others wrote and compiled the Tosafot. And again, the Tosafot would be written down in the later stages of Rashi's life and also into the lifetime of both the Rambam and his father. Now, here's a map of Islamic Spain in 756. Nearly all of Spain in 756 is under control of Islam. Now, from that period in the 700s, which you just saw, you now have in front of you a map of Islamic Spain in 1162. Again, just like the crusading armies in the Middle East, there is this back and forth between Christendom and Islam in Spain. And so in the middle of Maimonides' life, maybe about 40%, I would estimate, is still under Islamic domain. In the north, it's now become back Christian kingdoms. Now, let's see. I'm starting with this Council of Elvira, which took place in 305 CE. I'm bringing this up for several reasons. First, there was a Jewish presence in Spain since the times of the Roman Empire. 305 CE was when there was this Council of Elvira was held in the Roman province of Hispania Baetica in southern Spain. And there was 81 canons that were recorded, which was regarding the discipline and conduct of the Christian community. And in these canons, there were certain canons that called for the separation between Christians and Jewish community. It forbade Christians from living in Jewish households or from eating in the company of Jews. And it forbade Jews from blessing the produce of fields owned by Christians. So there's already a beginning under Christian domain that there's in the Christian hierarchy belief that there has to be a separation between the two communities. In about 313, which is just only about 7 years after this council, Christianity became the pronounced religion within the Roman Empire, where there was a major battle by Constantine versus another army. The Christian domain within Spain continued up and through the Visigothic period, where the Visigothic tribes invaded in Spain in 587. Their king Rocared, converted to Catholicism in 587. And this began a period where Jews were really under attack. In 613, Jews were forced to convert or leave the Visigothic kingdom. From 613 to the Islamic Conquest, which is in 711, the Visigothic kings implemented periods of religious repression. So which this involved impoverishment, onerous taxation, and there were, at times, there was a requirement for Jewish children from the age 7 to be taught by Christian tutors. So the Umayyad, which was a Muslim force that came out of North Africa, invaded Spain in 711, and this now began the period of the Muslim conquest of Spain. There was no, at this time, there was no openly professing Jews in Spain when the Muslims invaded. The crypto Jews, so whoever, if they were Jews, they were crypto Jews, and they welcomed the Muslim invaders. The Umayyad kingdom eventually established Cordoba as their capital in 755. There was a tolerance of the Umayyad kingdom for the Jews, and so that many Jews started now coming back to Spain, or it became a refuge for Jews. This now began the period of what might be considered the golden age of Spain for Jews. I'm not a particular strong believer in this notion of a golden age of Jews in Spain, but I'll leave that to other people to think that, consider that. The reality to me is that probably this golden age of Spain lasted from about 711 into the 900s, maybe around the year 2000. Excuse me. What happened is by the year about this time period, the Christian armies were continuing to put a pressure onto the Umayyad kingdom. It ends up being that there's the Muslim rule ended up being divided up into a number of smaller kingdoms by the time of 1086. They were in 1086. There was a Christian victory at Toledo, and the number of the Muslim kingdoms asked North Africa Muslims to come in and help them out and to stop the Christian onslaught. So one of these tribes that was called the Almoravids, they came in 1086, and as a result of this
Oleg one. Are you Oleg one?
I'm sorry. Can you if you could put your question into the chat, that would be helpful. Okay. The Almohads came in, which was another Muslim group that came in and invaded in 1145. Now, Andalusia is another name for the Islamic area of Spain. So the Almohads came in 1145, and they united North Africa and Andalusia under the rule of a single empire. So again, this is about the time where there's maybe 40% of Spain is under Islamic control, and the northern part under Christian domain. So with the invasion of the Almohads, the practice of Jewish religion became forbidden, and Jews were compelled to embrace Islam outwardly. Now, so as I said, this is a timeline for Maimonides' family in Spain and Morocco. Cordoba, as I said, fell to the Almohads in 1148, which actually was when Maimonides was 13 years old. Maimonides was born again in 1135. So you now have this very conservative, very rigid Islamic rule that's now beginning. With this onslaught of this new rule in Islamic Spain, Maimonides' family actually started to wander. The Jews faced religious persecution under the Almohads. The And Maimonides' family wandered from place to place in Spain and up until 1160. And I think in part is to really define a place where they felt they could practice as freely as Jews, but that again, that was very nearly
Impossible.
impossible. It was impossible. According to some Muslim authorities, Maimonides' family converted somewhere between 1150 and 1160. We would clearly call this from Maimonides later in life, you see all the tremendous writings and knowledge that he pursued in terms of Jewish learning and education, and clearly this was a feigned conversion. Maimonides and his family lived in Morocco from about 1160 to 1165. They moved there really seeking a place where they thought that it would be better than what was happening in Spain. Morocco was at this time was seen as a better, easier place to live as a crypto Jew. By about 1163, crypto Jews were well entrenched in Muslim society. Unfortunately, by this,
Page bigger.
and somebody, I think, can please everybody go on mute?
Not me.
Okay, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, by this year, condition worsened for the Jews in 1163. So Maimonides and his family left Morocco once there was they saw the martyrdom of a Judah ibn Susan, which was a major Jewish person in that time, which actually was at this point would be, unfortunately, crypto Jews were then. Some of Maimonides' early writings I'm covering a time period, which 1165, which would make Maimonides about 30 years old, the time that they're leaving Spain, leaving Morocco. And I'm listening just to give you an idea of some of his early writings. I'm going to start with some of his non-Jewish religious texts. At this time, if you were an author, you'd have to seek a special benefactor to fund your book, or you'd have to get a friend to fund it. He wrote what was called the Words of Logic around the time he was in Fez, and this was considered a major logic treatise, and it was important for the study of medicine. Maimonides did a number of works as well in writing on geometry and optics. He did a treatise as well on the calendar. He wrote a primer on the calendar at the age of 20. So, and at this age, it demonstrated a command of and knowledge of astronomy, which was needed to write this treatise. Some of his rabbinic writings, so again, as I was saying, that we're talking about Maimonides doing all of this in the time that he's in his, it's really astounding, because if you go back to what I said earlier, from in 1145 to 1160, when Maimonides' family was still in Spain, they were moving around constantly to different locations. And so he's carrying on and writing and learning, becoming a tremendous intellectual, but while the family's on the move. In addition, similarly, that they moved on in Morocco after only 5 years. But here's some of his rabbinic writings that was written in this time period up until about the age of 30. He wrote commentary on 3 of the 6 orders of the Babylonian Talmud. He wrote on the precepts of the Jerusalem Talmud, and he believed, Maimonides' belief was that he lauded the Jerusalem Talmud. He actually preferred it over the Babylonian Talmud. he saw in his eyes the Babylonian Talmud really stated a lot of decisions without giving rationale for that decision. What's happened in subsequently, it's now now over the many ages afterwards, the Babylonian Talmud became the premier Talmud that's used by Jewish Rabbanim. In his commentary on the Mishnah, I found this was kind of interesting. Maimonides sought reasons for the commandments, and particularly also about the 10 Commandments in particular. What was happening, the rabbinic sages in earlier periods had abolished the custom of reciting the 10 Commandments in the daily prayer. And they did this because they were concerned that heretics claimed the 10 Commandments are the only part of the Torah given to Moses at Sinai. And so Maimonides felt that he wanted to really give some more rationale to the commandments in response to this. So again, in 1165, Maimonides and his father and his brother David leave Morocco, and they arrive in Akko about a month later in May 16th, 1165. The family visited many of the sacred sites in Islam, and possibly as a way to atone for conversion to Islam. That's actually a suggestion by a book that many of which I'm talking about tonight comes from a book called Maimonides, The Life and the World of One of Civilization's Greatest Minds by Joel Kramer. And so that was a particular statement that he has made. Akko at this time was an international port for goods shipped from the Far East to the Mediterranean. And by the 13th century, there were estimates there was a population of about 40,000, which is about 2 centuries after this time period. In 1170, the Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela found 200 Jewish families and 3 rabbis serving the community of Akko. There was also a belief that David, which was Maimonides' brother, was the one who supported the family, and he did this through commercial trade. Akko is considered vital to the Christian hold on the Holy Land. In Morocco, Maimonides saw Islam as triumphant. Now in Akko, he sees the Muslims as demoralized. Before I just go on, I just want one more mention about David, his brother. David was traveling at the point that when Maimonides actually ends up in Egypt, David is out traveling abroad in terms of doing commercial trade, and he's killed by shipwreck. And Maimonides was devastated for about 8 years of his life in his early period in Egypt because of the death of David. Now, to give you a picture about what Maimonides saw when he arrived in the land of Israel in 1165, I've borrowed a quote about the Joel Kramer book, which he quoted a Muslim traveler, Ibn Jabbar, and this gentleman wrote about Akko. And he says, Akko is the capital of the Frankish cities in Syria. And there the unloading was a place of ships reared aloft in the sea-like mountains, and a port call for all ships and caravans, and the meeting place of Muslims and Christian merchants from all regions. Its roads and streets are choked by the press of men, so that it's hard to put foot to ground. Unbelief and impiousness there burn fiercely, and pigs and crosses abound. It stinks and is filthy, being full of refuse and excrement. The Franks ravished from the Muslim lands, and the eyes of Islam were swollen and weeping for it. Mosques became churches and minarets, bell towers, but God kept undefiled one part of the principal mosque, which remains in the hands of Muslims as a small mosque. Now, upon the arrival of Maimonides and his father and David in the Near East in 1165, it was a time of the Crusades and the Crusader kingdoms. You have here a picture, or a map of the Near East. The Crusades were called in 1096 by Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II was actually having his own problems in Europe, where there was the rise of very strong European kingdoms, and they were actually contesting the Pope for power within Europe. And so this may have been, the call for the crusade may have been in part a way in which Pope Urban II was able to reassert authority. The Byzantine Empire had written a number of letters to the Roman Pope seeking help, because the Byzantine Empire was actually under constant attack by Muslim armies. Actually, the Byzantine Empire was the successor to the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and it had major holdings, geographic holdings throughout the Middle East and even into Africa and even into Europe. But by the time of the Crusades, which started in 1096, there was really just this rump state of the Byzantine Empire. And so they had this call to the Pope. The Pope sends his army, a army of tens of thousands of poor and wealthy persons on the onslaught through Europe into the Middle East. And what happened is that this army of crusaders now start winning victories against the Muslim rule, and they set up a number of principalities. There was a principality set up in Armenia, one in Edessa, one in Antioch, Tripoli, and ultimately into Jerusalem, Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1099. Now, none of these areas were given back to the Byzantine Empire. They remained Catholic domains. Maimonides' trip to Jerusalem, when his family traveled to Jerusalem, it was actually at a time of danger, in part due to the hostilities involving the Second Crusade. But travel was always very difficult wherever you were at this time period, whether it was in Europe or even in the Middle East. There was when Maimonides did arrive in Jerusalem, there was no Jewish presence in Jerusalem. 10 Jews and Muslims were massacred when the Crusaders took over the city in 1099. After Saladin reconquered the city for the Muslims in 1187, Jews were allowed to return to the city and reestablish. A majority of the Christians in Jerusalem at the time of Maimonides' arrival were of French descent. French was the main language of communication, with Latin used for official documents. The Crusaders turned the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque into churches. Maimonides did not regard living in the land of Israel as a commandment obligating all Jews. And this could probably foretell why he ultimately ended up going to Egypt. Now, I want to go back now to what I said initially, which was Maimonides' belief in martyrdom and what was his response to it. Maimonides read everything he could on idolatry. His goal was to distance the people from the allure of idolatry. We talked about when Maimonides was in Spain and North Africa, Jews were forced to convert to Islam. And so Jews like Maimonides ended up practicing in private. At the same time, with the time of Rashi, which was lived until 1105, and just before Maimonides, that was the period when Jews were attacked viciously by this onslaught of the crusading army, and many of them they were caused to have a martyr death. So at this time, Maimonides really wanted to see what was trying to come up with a different answer than just martyrdom. Maimonides' father wrote what was called a letter called Igarat HaNechman, which was a letter of consolation. The letter assured Jews who converted to Islam that if they said that their Hebrew prayers, even in very short form, and did mitzvahs, they still remained a Jew, even though they may have they had done this a feigned conversion to Islam. Maimonides wrote a similar letter called the Igarat Kiddush Hashem, letter of sanctification of the divine name. In general, when the Jews were forced to convert, Muslim authorities were generally satisfied with if they saw an external conformity by the converts. However, this attitude changed from time to time. So Maimonides, when he wrote this letter of sanctification, he sought to comfort, not to cast blame on Jews who converted to Islam. He urged these Jews to observe Jewish religious law covertly, and his conclusion was that Jews should remain in the realm of the forced conversion, but where and when possible, the Jews should leave that country and go to a place where they could practice freely as a Jew. Again, in summary, I think Rambam condoned the conversion to Islam, but he really tried to discourage martyrdom. And as I said, recommended migration to where one could ultimately practice openly as a Jew. Now, I'm going to try to do a contrast between Jews in Muslim countries and European Jews. European Jews embraced martyrdom at the time of the Crusades, in part because they viewed Christianity as polytheism. Jews in Islamic countries did not see Islam as polytheistic. These Jews preferred survival to martyrdom. Rashi's view on forced conversion was very similar to Maimonides and his father. Rashi, as I said, lived at the time of the First Crusade, and Rashi believed that if a Jew sinned, he still remained an Israelite. And Rashi sought to preserve Judaism by promoting repentance and leaving open the possibility that the person will return to Judaism. Now, I'm going to talk about what the Talmud's view is on conversion, or in this case, it's really what the Talmud talks about idolatry. Under the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Avodat Sarah, it states, in general, a Jew who is forced to practice idolatry at the cost of his life, the idolatry is permitted if it's in private. However, if it's done in public, which is defined as in the presence of 10 Jews, then the Jew must give up his life. Now, going to talk about, even though Rashi may have been sympathetic and had similar views to Maimonides, that doesn't necessarily hold true for what happened overall in the period of when there was this onslaught of a crusading army that was moving en masse through Europe. Tosafos' commentary, which again is commentary that was written down in the later stages of Rashi's life, or in the or during the time period of the Rambam. And Tosafot commentary in the Art Scroll Babylonian Talmud, which it was actually, I'm using it as a English version, and one of the footnotes had suggested that the halacha there is even more restrictive under the Tosafot's commentary than what is actually written in the Avodat Zarah tractate itself. And here, on the Tosafot's commentary says, in the case of idolatry, illicit relations, or murder, one must sacrifice his life, even if it's done in private, even if the your practice of this other religion is done in private. The authors of the medieval narratives in the Piyutim in the Rhineland, which is Germany, Germanic lands, in 1096 glorified the Masada martyrs of the Jewish Roman wars. Now, I have here just a brief listing of some of Maimonides' later years in brief. In 1166, Maimonides' family moved on to Egypt, and they arrived at the port of Alexandria. Maimonides arrived in Egypt at the age of 31. And Egypt was his home after this for about 38 years, a little over half of his life. Maimonides permanently settled in Fustat, which is Old Cairo. About 1177, Maimonides was recognized as the head of the Jewish community of Fustat. And about 1180, or I have here 1185, Maimonides was appointed one of the court physicians to Saladin, and as what the Saladin court. At this time period, the Karaites were a dominant and wealthy community upon his arrival in Egypt. And I'm not going to go into it, but it's my understanding that Maimonides, and as well as the son, did a number of things that actually diminished this dominance by the Karaites in Egypt. I have here a statue of Maimonides that was in the Jewish quarter in Cordoba, Spain. And here he's seen as a lawgiver. With that, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to take any questions that people may have. Let me stop share. Everybody, go ahead.
The one question in the chat was from earlier on when you spoke about the family leaving Fez, and the question was, what was the composition of Rambam's family at the time? Was it mother, father, brother, sister?
His mother had passed away. I don't know. I'm not sure about whether his sister, whether he had sisters. I don't know. Harry, you have an answer on that? Whether he
actually, he had at least one sister that we know of, and possibly two that went to Egypt with him, and one that lived outside of Egypt, probably still in Morocco. And we know this from letters where good wishes are sent to the sisters. Sorry.
Let me see, is there any other questions?
So there's a question from Jan Sadaka on what the practice of medicine was like in the 12th century.
Well,
I'm sure you're an expert.
Well, Maimonides was considered a major position at the time, and in addition to being this great Jewish lawgiver. I don't know. This is something that I can look up and try to get back to you, Jan, on what the practice of medicine is this time. But
I just think it's interesting that he was a court. You say he was a court physician, not the court physician. Is that? And what does that mean? Does that mean that there was a medical group that consulted? What were they using leeches? I mean, were they
Leeches I can't speak.
letting blood, etc.?
Leeches I can't speak to, but he was, if we're talking about a very, very limited number. Maybe, he is, if not, you could call him perhaps the court physician. If not, maybe there's one or two others. But he is the predominant court physician at the time. Do we have any other questions at all? I'm happy to answer anything, or at least get back to you on what was physician life like at the time.
So so we understand there was one sister left behind in Morocco. Is that the general consensus?
I think, yes, that's what Harry just said.
You're on mute. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No, can't hear Harry.
Sorry, yes, there was one sister. We think there was one sister left in Morocco from letters that were sent, and one sister that married the brother of Maimonides' second wife, or the wife he married in Egypt. So Maimonides and his sister were married to a brother and sister in the same family. And then there may have been a second sister in Egypt. That's a little less clear, I believe.
Were there any descendants in Morocco of the Maimonides line?
I think the family generally left at the time. I have to actually ask this, or take a time out on the presentation, because we were at 7:45. We were going to have Rabbi Kavka do a presentation, and I'm just seeing if he's here.
Yeah, Kafka's there.
Thank you, Benson. That was unbelievable. So much research and information, wow, has gone into that. Yashar Koach, Chazak Baruch, that was unbelievable. I think we need a sequel, because now we need to talk about all the stories that we've heard when he was the court physician in Egypt, and hopefully you'll do that sometime, because some of those stories are quite fascinating. When I saw this being presented, I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing a couple weeks back, because today, the day scheduled for this presentation actually turns out to be the very day that Jews all around the world are celebrating the conclusion of Maimonides' work, the Mishne Torah. And it's a study cycle that was started 40 cycles ago, and in the year 1984. And this year they're culminating the 40th time that they're finishing it. So immediately I picked up the phone to Benson and I said, I think that it would be apropos to end off the presentation today, after we've learned so much about the Rambam and his life, to learn a little bit about his work and his halachic contribution, particularly since this is what Jews all around the world, literally in every single country, are doing at this very moment. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the Mishna Torah. I'm going to share my screen. I think I was given that capability. Let's see. Yes, I am. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen here. And just for the sense of time, we'll probably go for another 15 minutes as we conclude the portion here about the work of the Rambam Mishne Torah. So this is the Mishne Torah. It's all of 14 volumes that he artfully divided Jewish law into. And you had to understand the context. At the time, there was no work like this that covered the entirety of the Torah together in one codified book. There was the Talmud, which was very complex. You needed to be a tremendous scholar to be able to not only understand the Talmud, but to bring together all the commentary that had been presented over the years from generation to generation. And what the Rambam did was really foundational in halachic work. He took everything that we know and he put it together in a very straightforward, easy to understand. And he writes that in his introduction. If you want to know anything about Mishna Torah and this seminal work, you got to look at his introduction to the Mishna Torah. I'll try to put a link in the chat, or if someone's able to put a link in the chat to Safaria or something of that nature, where you can see his introduction, why he actually wrote this book. And what he explained is that, unfortunately, scholars are few, and we don't have the leadership that we used to, where a person who had any type of question was able to go to rabbi and get an answer. And even some of the rabbis were forgetting the conclusions on the halachic analysis. And so he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the entirety of the Torah, unique to Mishna Torah. There's no other halachic work that puts the entirety of the Torah into one book. And what I mean by that is, many of the laws, and I think Benson, you and I talked about this, are in relation to, let's say, the Bet Mikdash, the Holy Temple, or the land of Israel, when the Jews are ruling it. The laws of when the Messiah, the Meshiach, will come. These are things that are not covered in any other halachic work because they're not relevant, so to speak. The Rambam, though, felt like it was vital that the entirety of the Torah was put into one work. He even goes on to say, and this was quoted by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who started this learning cycle of the Rambam, that you can go and read the Chumash and then read his book, the Rambam. The Rambam says about his own book, read my book, and with that, you've read the entirety of the Torah. Now, there are many, of course, as Benson covered, who disagreed with the Rambam and said that's impossible. You cannot do that. But, notwithstanding their opinions, the Rambam was a pillar in halachic ruling, and we cannot take his ruling lightly. So the fact that he said that you could read the Chumash, you could read the Bible, and then go straight to Mishna Torah, and with that you completed the entire Torah, is phenomenal. It really is. It's something outer worldly for anyone who's studied Torah. It really, and that a halachic authority would say that, I mean, there's nothing else like it. In how Mishna Torah has been used in halachic analysis, there were three individuals for the most part in which our modern day halacha, Jewish law, is based on. That's the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. Those three authorities, and generally the majority of the three is going to be the ruling halachic Jewish law opinion. And that's what we'll practice today based on the majority of those three. So if there's a disagreement, we'll go by the two that do agree. So this work of Mishna Torah, the point I'm trying to make is this work of Mishna Torah is foundational to Judaism. The Rambam is foundational to Judaism till today. And that's what makes a Siyum, completion of the Rambam today, on its 40th cycle, so significant. So without further ado, I'd like to make the Siyum. It begins with the last halacha of the 14th book, which I have right here. And the halachot in the 14th book discuss the laws of the Messiah, of the Meshiach. And this is what the last halacha reads. At that time, there will be no famine, envy, competition for goods. There's going to be plenty. There's going to be abundance. The times of Meshiach, no one will be competing with each other. And all the wonderful things that we have in the world will be so plentiful like the dust of the earth. So in the previous halacha, the Rambam points out that you might think, okay, so we're waiting for Meshiach. Why? Because that's going to be a time where candy is going to grow on the trees, money is going to grow on the trees, it's going to be a great time. The Rambam says in the previous halacha, and he emphasizes again here, that's incorrect. Therefore, the occupation of everybody will be just trying to understand and know God, because they're going to have everything they need. Their needs are going to be fulfilled. I guess you could say it's somewhat akin to the experience the Jews had in the desert, where all the needs were provided, and therefore they were just able to dedicate themselves to the service of God. And that's going to be the time when Mashiach comes. And therefore, and therefore, because people will be so dedicated and so invested in understanding God, they will have a very, very comprehensive understanding and deep understanding of our Creator of God. Shene'emar, like it says, Ki mala'a ha'aret de'at Hashem kamayim layam mechasim. And at that time, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God just the same way that the water fills the seas. And just as you could perhaps say the analogy given here of the sea, just as you look at the sea, you don't necessarily see all the depth and significance. You don't see the creatures. It just looks like water. You're not able to really comprehend the extensiveness of our oceans and seas. The same thing is now, we don't fully comprehend it. But when the Mashiach will come, then we will be completely free to engross ourselves in the study of Torah to the degree that we'll have revelations that we never could have even fathomed. There are some creatures in the sea we don't even know exist because we haven't been able to get to the depths of the ocean. Same thing is regarding the depths of the Torah. So with that, Mazal Tov, we conclude together with the entire world, all over the world, the study of the 14th book of the Rambam and the entire Mishne Torah. In Judaism, whenever we finish something, we never want to just end with the Torah. Immediately we try to begin it, like we do on Simchat Torah. Just as we end the Torah, we immediately read Bereshit, we immediately begin. So without further ado, take another moment here to begin the halachot of the Rambam. Beginning of Mishne Torah, the Rambam talks about the pillars of our faith. And again, this is something which is not talked about in any other halachic work. The Rambam really tried to include everything there is to know about Judaism in his work, which is, again, what makes the book so special. And he begins as follows: Yisod ha-yisodot v'amud ha-chachmot, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom. What is the ultimate wisdom? Leda, to know, sheyesha matzur yishon, to know that there is a primary bring, v'hu mamtzi kol nimsa, and he brings into existence all other existence. When a person has that notion ingrained in his mind, with that understanding, with that knowledge, you're able to have the proper perspective of the world. B'chol hanimtzaim, and everything that exists, b'shamayim va'aretz u'ma shebenehem, between the heavens and the earth, and now all that is between them, lo nimtzu elama mitat hamatzoi. They only came into existence through his truth, through his being, through his oneness. And with that foundation, a person is able to have proper faith and proper understanding of the workings of the world. To the degree, and I'll just read one more line here from the Rambam, if one would imagine that he does not exist, then no other being would be able to exist. If you think about that, you could sit on this, you can have a long discussion about it. These words are very powerful. Of course, this is the foundation of faith. And that's why the Rambam chose to begin the Mishne Torah, book of Halacha, with these words. A little bit about the learning cycle of Mishne Torah. Like I said, this is the 40th completion, and there's multiple cycles which a person can pick from. So there is the cycle which studies 3 chapters a day, which is of course more intense. Let me see if I can put it up here. So you have the 3 chapters a day, and then you have the 1 chapter a day, which you'll finish every 3 years. And then there is the daily mitzvah, in which every single day you read a mitzvah of the 613 mitzvot. And with that, throughout in the course of less than 1 year, you finish all the mitzvot in the Torah, and you have a deep comprehension, because the Rambam, in addition to his Mishne Torah, also wrote a compilation of all the mitzvot called Sefer Mitzvot. I'm going to put this link into the chat so that if someone wants to check it out and see how this, potentially could be accessible, that they should be able to do that. There are classes on it. It really is a great resource, again, to be able to complete the entirety of the Torah in the course of just 1 year or perhaps 3 years. One of the other reasons that the Lubavitch Rebbe endorsed the notion of going through Mishne Torah, with this I'll conclude, is he said that now more than ever, it is vital that we have something that unites us. Stop the screen share here, something that unites us. He said that with any other type of study, it's very hard to be able to find something that is on a level that's consistent with everybody. Some people might be able to learn a little more, some people learn a little less. At the time, there was the Daf Yomi, which is going through the Talmud. Of course, as the Rambam writes himself, the Talmud is a very complex work, and that's certainly not something that is accessible to all. But the Rambam on the Mishne Torah, on the other hand, is something that, in his own testimony at the beginning of his introduction, he said, I wrote it b'safa bura u'ktsara, very clear and concise, similar to the Mishnah in its simplistic understanding and accessibility. And that's why it has become something that is so widely learned all over the world, because it really is accessible to so many different people on so many different levels. I'll conclude with a story. I didn't think I was going to share this story, but then Benson, you spoke so much about conversion of the faith and the idea that the Rambam and Rashi felt that a person is still able to stay within their faith. Perhaps this could be an encouraging little push to help us realize that Judaism is ours, the Torah is ours. This is something that we are able to, and we never lose it. There's nothing that we could do as illiterate or less knowledgeable as we think we might be. It's ours. And therefore, if this is something that interests us, we can certainly take that jump. So the story goes that there was once an individual who came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe for the Sunday dollars. Every Sunday, the Lubavitcher Rebbe used to hand out dollars, and people would ask for blessings. And people would come from all walks of life, Jews and non-Jews. One particular individual came to the Rebbe after standing in a line for a very long time. These lines used to span for many hours. He finally gets to the Rebbe and he says, I was born Jewish, but I converted to Christianity, and I want you to know, Rebbe, I'm very happy. And the Rebbe went on to say that, it's unfortunate that you feel so happy with something that is not part of your identity. And he blessed him that he should be able to find, his identity and be happy with it. And there's a a woman that I'm dealing with who has unfortunately mental illness. She doesn't even know that she has it, and that's perhaps the most dangerous thing. And then they're not able to help themselves. So there have been this encounter, which is actually recorded on video. He says that that's the most frightening thing about your situation is that you were born Jewish. That's clearly your identity, but you're happy with where you are, and you don't see the need to find that inner soul within you. They concluded the conversation, and the individual said, "Well, can I at least give you my book that I wrote on Christianity?" And the Rebbe said, "Sure, I'll take your book." And he said, "I'm taking your book so that you should give it to one less person. One less person will be able to have access to it." But he took the book and he moved on. And you would think that a leader of that magnitude, someone who's telling me he converted to Christianity, he wouldn't get that type of attention from the Rebbe. He wouldn't get that care and dedication. And what's interesting is that a few years ago, there were some yeshiva boys that were in Switzerland, and they came across a Jew in his talis and tefillin davening in a shul. And these young yeshiva boys recognized the man being the guy from this video. And he said, just to confirm it, they asked, have you been by the Lubavitcher Rebbe? He said, "Sure, I've been there." And he recounted the story. Of course, they all knew it because they had seen it in the video. And he said that encounter was life-changing. The care and affection that he received, although he clearly stated that he had abandoned the faith, was something that touched him tremendously. And because of that, he turned his life around. And of course, as an observant Jew, now living, davening with talis and tefillin every day. And the message there is, along the lines of Benson, we used to discuss that a Jew is a Jew, the Jew is a Jew, and no matter where we find ourselves and where we think how unholy or holy we think we are, that spark is always in us. And whether a person can go through a conversion, it's as Benson covered, it's a extensive conversation, which probably you can have a whole series of lectures, or perhaps an entire course on, the ability, the difference between Islam and Christianity, etc. But just at its core, the idea that Judaism is ours, the idea that the Torah is ours, and no matter what we do, it doesn't affect our relationship to the Torah, our relationship to God. And at any given moment, we can decide that this is something we want to make a part of our life, and literally make a complete U-turn if it's necessary. For some of us, it's just a little turn to something a little bit more, more inspiring, and particularly when it comes to the study of the Rambam, the Mishne Torah. This certainly is a phenomenal way to engross oneself in the study of the Torah. So Mazal Tov, Benson, again, thank you for including me and the Siyum in this program. That was a beautiful presentation, and Mazal Tov to everybody. You're muted. Benson, you're muted.
Hi, it's just Stanley Orman saying thank you very much to everyone for a very interesting evening. Many thanks.
Yeah, Rabbi, there's a question which says, is there a correlation between the finishing of a yearly cycle and the Rebbe's yard site?
There isn't. The yearly cycle is actually less than a year by about a month. And so it keeps on getting pushed out. The first time it was celebrated right before Pesach, and it's gone full circle around the year a couple times because we're at the 40th conclusion here. The fact that it was concluded on the day of his passing is something, of course, of tremendous significance today or yesterday. And people celebrate the conclusion yesterday. I myself was in New York. I stood online to go into the Rebbe's resting place for a prayer, and for over 4 hours, and I think I was in there for maybe less than 40 seconds. So it's definitely a very special day. And the fact that the Siyum HaRambam happened on the very day of his yahrzeit this time around is, of course, very, very special.
And there was one question from someone about the guide to for the perplexed, and I will offline. I'll contact the individual, and we'll chat about that. But thank you very much to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Rabbi Kavka, for an excellent presentation that really brought, I think, the whole evening to really a fullness, and we really much appreciate it here at Magen David. And I'll just say good night to everyone, and see you soon. Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, Benson. It was really, really very fine. Very fine evening.
Thank you.